The hush that fell over Harrison and Elm was almost sacred. Forks froze midair. The pianist's fingers hovered above the keys, and even the hum of conversation dissolved into a stunned silence. Every eye turned toward the small table by the window, where an elderly Japanese man sat alone beneath the golden glow of a chandelier. Across from him, a gray-haired waitress in a crisp black uniform bowed deeply, her hands folded with quiet respect. "Konbanwa, Takahama-sama," she said softly, her voice clear yet gentle. "Dozo oyasumi kudasai." The old man blinked in disbelief. Then his lips trembled into a smile that had not visited his face in years. Only seconds earlier, he had been invisible. Staff brushed past him, impatient with his halting English. Diners whispered, assuming he was another confused tourist. But now, with a single greeting, the air shifted. The woman's words bridged a silence that money could never cross. Her name was Mary Collins, 58. A widow who had traded a classroom for a waitress apron when medical bills swallowed her savings. Once, she had taught Japanese at a community college. Now she worked double shifts to pay for her daughter's therapy. Her hands still carried the grace of a teacher, steady, deliberate, humble. Moments before the silence broke, Mary had watched a young waiter spill water on the man's sleeve and rush away, muttering an apology he couldn't understand. The old man's face had flushed with quiet shame. Mary felt something twist inside her. She had seen that same look on her husband's face the year his company laid him off, dignity meeting humiliation. So she stepped forward. One choice, one word of kindness. At the corner booth, Hiro Takahama, the man's son and CEO of a global tech empire, looked up from his phone. The waitress's accent was flawless. He froze mid-scroll, recognizing the formal phrasing of his hometown dialect, a version even Tokyo elites rarely used. His father's posture straightened, his hands pressed together in gratitude. "Arigato, arigato gozaimasu," the old man murmured. Mary smiled, not realizing the weight of her gesture. Around them, the frozen room slowly exhaled. Cutlery clinked again. The pianist struck a hesitant note. But Hiro remained still, watching the woman who had just reminded him of something his board meetings and private jets never could respect. And in that quiet heartbeat, a story began not about wealth or language, but about a woman who saw what no one else did. Mary barely noticed the tremor in her hands as she poured tea into the delicate white cup, her heart still echoing with the old man's soft words of gratitude. The scent of roasted barley and lemon peel rose like memory, carrying her back to the classroom she once loved, where she used to teach phrases of courtesy to wide-eyed students dreaming of Kyoto. Across the table, Mr. Takahama lifted the cup with both hands, his movements precise, reverent, like a prayer whispered to the past. Around them, the restaurant's rhythm began to move again, muted laughter. The gentle scrape of chairs, the pianist testing a cautious melody. Yet the air had changed. Every sound felt filtered through something fragile and newly sacred. At the far corner, Hiro Takahama's expression was unreadable. He leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening, as he observed the strange intimacy unfolding between his father and the waitress. The woman spoke slowly, clearly, her tone carrying that rare softness found only in those who have known loss. Her uniform was spotless but old, the fabric stretched faintly at the seams, and her hair pinned with the care of someone who cannot afford mistakes. He had seen countless people bow to his father, executives, ministers, philanthropists, but none with this quiet dignity that expected nothing in return. Sophie, the manager, appeared beside the counter, her heels clicking like warning bells across the marble floor. She whispered sharply, her voice dipped in corporate politeness. "Mary, don't make conversation with the VIP guest. Just serve and step away." Mary nodded, but her gaze didn't leave the man who sat before her, fragile yet radiant with gratitude. She understood rules, but she also understood moments that mattered more than rules ever could. When Mr. Takahama asked softly, in halting English, if the restaurant served miso shiru, she translated it aloud with perfect pronunciation, sparing him the humiliation of being misunderstood again. Sophie's lips pressed into a thin line. "He can use the menu," she muttered, but Hiro's voice cut through the air before she could continue. "He prefers to speak in Japanese," he said evenly, standing now, every inch the man of power, though his tone carried a calm that silenced even the nearest tables. The staff froze again, uncertain whether to bow or step back. Mary blinked, realizing that the quiet observer from the corner booth was not just another businessman but the man who controlled half the tech startups on the eastern seaboard. "Do you know who that is?" Sophie whispered behind her, panic creeping into her voice. "That's Hiro Takahama, founder of Axis Dynamics." But Mary wasn't listening. Her attention remained fixed on the older man, who now looked up at his son with mild surprise. "Hiro," he said softly in Japanese, "you came after all." The warmth in his tone sliced through the tension like sunlight through frost. Hiro approached their table, and Mary instinctively stepped back, not wanting to intrude. But the older man gestured for her to stay, his frail hand trembling slightly as it pointed toward her. "She speaks our language," he told his son, his voice filled with quiet pride. "No one here would speak to me, but she did." The son's eyes flickered between them, the waitress with tired eyes and the father he rarely saw without cameras or assistants. For a long moment, Hiro said nothing. The murmur of the restaurant receded until even the pianist hesitated once more. Then he bowed slightly toward Mary, a gesture so small yet heavy with meaning. "Thank you," he said. "You honored my father when everyone else ignored him." The words seemed to shock Sophie more than any reprimand could. She forced a smile, her voice brittle. "Of course, sir. We train our staff to be respectful." But Hiro ignored her. He looked directly at Mary, studying her the way an engineer studies the one detail that changes everything. "Where did you learn to speak Japanese so fluently?" he asked. Mary hesitated, unsure how much truth to offer. "I used to teach languages," she said finally, "before my husband passed away." Her voice was calm, steady, but beneath it was a tremor born from years of exhaustion and quiet survival. Hiro nodded slowly, as if that explained more than she realized. Mr. Takahama reached across the table, his fingertips brushing hers lightly. "Arigato," he said again, his eyes bright with gratitude that seemed deeper than mere thanks. "It has been many years since someone greeted me with such respect in this country." His tone carried both sadness and peace, and Mary felt an ache rise in her chest that she could not name. When the meal ended, Hiro instructed the hostess to ensure the bill was sent to his office. He lingered a moment longer, then turned to Mary once more. "My father enjoys company," he said quietly. "Would you mind checking on him again before he leaves?" His phrasing was polite, but his gaze carried a layer of curiosity that unsettled her, as if he were already thinking beyond the meal, beyond the night. Mary nodded, offering a small smile that barely reached her tired eyes. As she walked away, Sophie caught her arm. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" she hissed. "One wrong word and you could have offended the richest man in this city." Mary's answer was gentle but firm. "Then it's a good thing kindness doesn't offend anyone." From his seat, Hiro overheard the exchange, his lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. For the first time that evening, he understood that the woman's act wasn't about language at all. It was about something far rarer. Respect. The kind that couldn't be bought, rehearsed, or demanded. Outside, the city glowed in reflections of glass and neon, indifferent to the quiet miracle that had just unfolded inside Harrison and Elm. And somewhere in the lingering silence of that restaurant, an invisible thread stretched between three lives: a waitress who had lost everything, a son burdened by power, and a father reminded that humanity could still be spoken fluently. That night, long after the tables had been cleared and the chandeliers dimmed to their last amber glow, Mary stayed behind to wipe the marble counter, letting the rhythm of her cloth erase the echoes of another day's fatigue. Yet her mind lingered on the old man's gentle voice, and the way his son's expression had shifted, first guarded, then thoughtful, as though he had glimpsed something he could not categorize with profit margins or market reports. The restaurant felt strangely alive in its silence, like it was holding its breath for what would come next. 2 days later, the rumor spread through Harrison and Elm, like perfume spilled in the air. A fleet of black cars had stopped outside, and men in tailored suits stepped out with a precision that silenced the street. Sophie straightened her blazer 3 times before the door even opened. When Hiro Takahama entered, the world seemed to tilt slightly. The same composure that had unsettled her during dinner now carried a new gravity, as if he had arrived not to dine but to decide the fate of something larger than a restaurant. Behind him walked his father, cane tapping lightly, eyes shining with that same calm gratitude. Mary was at the service station, restocking glasses, when Sophie hissed her name in alarm. "Don't speak unless spoken to," she whispered, voice trembling with a reverence that bordered on fear. But Hiro was already approaching, his father keeping pace beside him, the hum of conversation collapsing into silence once more. The billionaire's son stopped at the table they had sat at before, fingers resting lightly on the back of the chair. "Miss Collins," he said, his tone measured but warm, "I hope we're not interrupting your shift." Mary turned slowly, her apron slightly creased, her expression humble yet unflinching. "Not at all, sir," she replied. "It's good to see you both again." Hiro exchanged a glance with his father, who gave a nod that seemed to grant silent permission. Then the younger man placed an envelope on the table, a thick, cream-colored document embossed with gold lettering. "My father wanted you to have this," he explained. "It's an invitation to the Takahama Cultural Foundation in Tokyo. We host an annual symposium about cross-cultural respect and communication. He believes you would understand its purpose better than most." "Oh?" Mary's breath caught in her throat. "I'm not a scholar anymore," she said softly, fingers trembling over the edge of the envelope. "I just serve coffee." The older man shook his head gently. "No," he said in deliberate English, each word careful, certain. "You serve respect. That is rarer." The room seemed to shrink around them. Even Sophie's usual impatience melted into uneasy admiration. Hiro continued, his gaze fixed on Mary with that same analytic curiosity she had noticed before. "In my world, people buy loyalty, rent compassion, and trade ethics for convenience," he said. "But what you did the other night reminded me that dignity is a language money still can't translate." Mary felt a flush rise in her cheeks, a warmth both humbling and disorienting. "I only did what anyone should do," she murmured. He was alone. He deserved kindness. Hiro's faint smile carried something almost wistful. "If that were true," he said, "we wouldn't be standing here today." At the next table, a couple of regular diners watched, pretending to read their menus, and even the pianist paused mid-song, letting the final note fade without resolution. The old man stood slowly, leaning on his cane, and reached out to pat Mary's hand. "You reminded my son of something I once taught him," he said, switching back to Japanese so fluidly that Mary almost wept at the sound. "Respect begins where pride ends." When they left, the restaurant exhaled again, the energy easing back into its habitual rhythm, but Mary felt the world had shifted ever so slightly on its axis. Sophie approached hesitantly, her voice lower now. "What was that about?" she asked. Mary smiled faintly, slipping the envelope into her pocket. "Just an invitation," she said. "Nothing more." But her tone carried a quiet wonder she couldn't hide. That evening, as the sky deepened into indigo and the city lights shimmered against the glass, Mary stepped outside for her break. She stood by the alley's edge, watching a boy chase a paper bag that fluttered like a bird, and realized how thin the line was between invisibility and recognition. For years, she had thought kindness was a fragile thing, easily overlooked in a city built on speed and power. Now she saw it for what it truly was, a force that could stop even the loudest rooms. The following week, an envelope arrived at her apartment, sealed with the Takahama crest. Inside was a plane ticket to Tokyo, a handwritten note, and a single phrase in Japanese. "Kotoba yori taisetsu na mono ga aru." There are things more important than words. She traced the calligraphy with her finger, feeling the ink as though it were still wet, alive with meaning. Mary never considered herself brave, but when she boarded that plane 3 months later, she did so without hesitation. The clouds outside the window, looked like folds of silk, the horizon pale gold as the sun lifted over the Pacific. In her lap rested a small photograph, a copy of the moment captured by a restaurant patron that night, showing her mid-bow before the old man's smile. The image had gone quietly viral online, captioned by strangers. "Respect needs no translation." Oh! When she finally arrived in Tokyo, she was greeted not by cameras or banners, but by a simple welcome sign handwritten in both English and Japanese. "We remember kindness." And in that instant, surrounded by strangers who bowed as she approached, Mary realized something she had taught long ago, but had almost forgotten herself, that language was never just words. It was recognition. It was grace. It was the bridge between hearts too proud or too wounded to reach each other. As she bowed back, the world seemed to grow silent again, as if time had paused just long enough to listen. The next morning in Tokyo, sunlight streamed through the high windows of the cultural center, washing the polished wood floors in a soft, amber hue that reminded Mary of the first light touching a classroom chalkboard years ago. She stood near the back of the auditorium, clutching the folder that contained her prepared remarks, though her hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of the journey that had carried her here. The stage ahead was decorated with white orchids and a banner written in both English and Japanese, its gold lettering proclaiming respect beyond borders, the language of humanity. She could see faces in the audience, scholars, diplomats, and executives, each one representing the kind of world she had once thought far beyond her reach. Hiro Takahama sat in the front row beside his father, his expression composed yet reflective, like a man trying to measure the depth of an unexpected change inside himself. When he caught Mary's eyes, he gave a brief nod, the kind of acknowledgement shared between equals rather than classes. For the first time, she realized the true symmetry of this moment. An aging waitress who had bowed from instinct, and a billionaire heir who had been taught all his life to look down. Now they stood on level ground, bound by something neither of them had planned, a moment of decency that refused to fade. As she stepped to the podium, the soft murmur of the crowd quieted into stillness. She began not with notes or formalities, but with a story. She told them about a night in New York when a tired waitress saw a lonely man being ignored by everyone around him. She described the spilled glass, the hush that followed, and the way one word spoken with respect had turned the air electric. Her voice remained steady, each syllable carrying both humility and strength, like a thread weaving its way through the room. "I used to teach language," she said, "but what I learned that night is that fluency means nothing without compassion. Grammar is useless if our hearts remain silent." A few people nodded, others leaned forward, drawn by the simplicity of her truth. Hiro's father listened with his eyes half closed, the ghost of a smile softening the sharpness of age. When Mary finished, there was a long pause, not hesitation, but reverence. Then came the applause, slow at first, then rising into a swell that filled the hall with something warmer than celebration, recognition. As she stepped down from the stage, Hiro met her at the stairs, offering his hand not as a businessman greeting a guest, but as a son honoring a teacher. "My father hasn't attended a public event in years," he said quietly, guiding her toward a small reception room filled with light and the scent of green tea. "He came because he said he wanted to see what kindness looks like when it grows into purpose." Mary smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "It doesn't grow because of me," she replied softly. "It grows because someone was willing to listen." Outside, the garden shimmered beneath a slow drizzle. The sound of rain on leaves was delicate, like the tapping of distant piano keys. They walked together along the covered walkway, saying little, yet understanding more with every step. Hiro stopped by a cherry tree whose blossoms had begun to open early. "I used to think leadership meant control," he said, his voice low. "Now I think it means remembering who you serve." He looked at her, the faintest smile playing on his lips. "You reminded me of that." Mary watched the petals flutter down, each one falling without resistance, as if surrender were its own kind of grace. "People forget because power is loud," she said, "and kindness whispers." Her words lingered in the damp air like incense. They returned, to the main hall, where journalists were beginning to gather, eager for a quote or photograph. But when asked how it felt to be honored by one of Japan's wealthiest families, Mary answered simply, "I'm just a woman who wanted to be understood." The statement traveled through media outlets that evening, shared and reposted, misquoted and analyzed, yet it carried an authenticity that no headline could distort. Later, as twilight deepened over Tokyo, Hiro invited her to dinner with his father at a quiet ryote overlooking the Sumida River. Lanterns floated on the current, their reflections rippling like small, steady hearts. "Over tea, Mr." Takahama spoke about the loneliness of success, about the isolation that comes from being revered but rarely seen. "In America," he said, "I was a number on a list of donors. You were the first person who saw me as a man." Mary bowed her head, humbled by the honesty of his words. "Sometimes," she replied, "we all need someone to remind us that respect isn't earned by wealth, but by how we give it." When the meal ended, Hiro rose and bowed to her once more, a gesture that felt both personal and ceremonial. "You've done more for my family than you know," he said. "And for me," she smiled gently. "Then promise me one thing," she said. "Keep listening to people who have no reason to speak loud." He hesitated, then nodded, the promise settling between them like a quiet vow. As Mary left the restaurant, the city's nightlights reflected in the river, each shimmer blending into the next until it looked like a tapestry of unspoken stories. She paused on the bridge, the cool wind brushing her face, and thought about how a single act, a bow, a word in another language, a moment of courage could ripple across continents and lives. The thought filled her with something close to peace. She realized she had not only changed a moment in one man's life, but had helped return something lost to his son: humility. Behind her, the faint strains of music drifted from a passing boat, the tune familiar and fragile, like the lullabies she used to hum to her daughter long ago. For the first time in years, Mary didn't feel invisible. She felt seen not for what she had lost, but for what she had given. And as the cherry blossoms fluttered across the dark water like falling stars, she whispered a quiet thank you to the city that had listened, to the family she had helped heal, and to the world for proving that decency, when spoken fluently, could still change everything. The weeks that followed passed like a slow dream, each day layering over the last with a rhythm that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. Tokyo hummed beneath Mary's window at dawn, trains whispering through the city like veins of silver light, their sound blending with the morning calls of street vendors and the faint rustle of newspapers sliding across polished floors. She had been offered a temporary position at the Takahama Foundation, assisting in developing new programs for international language education, a role she accepted with quiet disbelief. It was work that pulled her back to her roots. But it also stirred something new inside her, a feeling that she was standing at the intersection of who she had been and who she was becoming. Yet peace, she learned, is rarely permanent. On a drizzling afternoon, she arrived at the foundation to find the lobby brimming with unease. Assistants spoke in hurried Japanese, their tones clipped and anxious, and the usually calm Hiro stood near the elevator, phone pressed tightly to his ear. The conversation was short, tense, and ended with him exhaling in frustration. When his gaze met hers, it was not the steady calm she remembered, but something colder, heavier, as if the weight of the world had shifted again. "There's been a problem," he said finally. "A board member has been leaking internal documents to investors. Someone's trying to use my father's illness to push for his resignation." "I'll do." Mary listened in silence, understanding that the storm she saw in his eyes had little to do with business and everything to do with betrayal. "What can I do?" she asked softly. Hiro's answer came after a pause, deliberate and resigned. "Just keep being yourself," he said. "You have no idea how rare that is here." Then, lowering his voice, he added, "And stay away from reporters. They'll twist everything to make it look like we're hiding something." "Aye." That evening, as rain streaked across the glass walls of the foundation, Mary worked late, translating educational proposals into English. The corridors grew quiet. and the sound of her pen against paper was the only rhythm left in the building. She didn't notice the figure approaching until she heard footsteps stop behind her desk. It was Mr. Takahama, frailer now, wrapped in a light wool coat, his breath slightly uneven. "You remind me of my wife," he said in Japanese, his smile faint but sincere. She believed words could heal even the deepest fractures. "I think you believe that too." Mary placed her pen down, touched by the fragility of his voice. "Words only matter when they're heard," she replied gently. "Sometimes the world forgets to listen." The next morning brought a chill that hinted of early spring. News broke in the financial papers. Anonymous sources accused Hiro of using his father's charity for personal gain. The foundation's reputation trembled, and cameras appeared at its gates like crows drawn to the scent of conflict. Sophie, the old restaurant manager, called Mary from New York, her voice buzzing with gossip and half-concern. "They're saying that Billionaire you served is under investigation," she whispered. "You're not caught up in that, are you?" Mary smiled faintly, her tone calm. "I'm not caught in anything," she said. "I'm just standing where I've always stood next to what's right." By midday, Hiro had disappeared from the office, leaving behind only an urgent note asking her to continue the outreach work as planned. The media frenzy intensified, headlines spinning tales of corruption, ambition, and familial greed. But Mary, instead of retreating, continued teaching language sessions to local students, her voice steady, her demeanor unshaken. "Every sentence," she told them, "is an act of clarity. And clarity, even in chaos, is a kind of truth." Late one evening, as she locked up the empty classroom, she noticed Hiro waiting outside beneath the awning, his suit damp from the rain. He looked exhausted but calmer than before, as though the storm inside him had burned itself into quiet resolve. "They found the real culprit," he said simply. "It wasn't me. It was one of the investors trying to seize control." My father demanded a public apology. His eyes softened as he spoke, the harshness melting into gratitude. "I don't know how you stay so composed through everything," he added. "You treat turmoil like it's just another language to translate." Mary smiled, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Maybe because I've lived through enough storms to know they all speak the same way," she said. "Loud at first, then quiet when they're done." They walked together down the empty street, the neon reflections puddled at their feet, and for a brief moment the world seemed suspended again. No wealth, no hierarchy, just two people bound by the fragile grace of survival. A week later, during a press conference, Hiro did something that startled everyone. Instead of giving a speech about recovery or financial stability, he introduced Mary as the heart behind the foundation's rebirth. Cameras flashed as she stepped reluctantly onto the stage beside him, her presence simple yet radiant under the harsh light. "This woman," Hiro said, "reminded my father and me that humanity is our greatest investment. The rest is just accounting." The crowd fell silent, and then, almost imperceptibly, people began to rise one by one in quiet applause. When the event ended, Mary slipped away before the photographers could swarm her. She walked alone through the evening streets of Shibuya, watching the endless movement of strangers and realizing how small, yet how powerful, a single act of grace could be. The city shimmered around her like a sea of unspoken stories, and she felt a strange calm settle in her chest. At the corner, she paused before a flower stall where cherry blossoms had just begun to bloom. Their scent was faint, almost hidden beneath the perfume of the city, but it was there gentle, persistent, undeniable. She thought of the night she had bowed to a forgotten man in a crowded restaurant, of the silence that followed, and of how everything since had unfolded from that single moment of respect. Looking up at the sky where neon lights tangled with stars, she whispered to herself, "Kindness isn't quiet. It just waits for the world to listen." And as she walked home, the rain began again, soft and rhythmic, falling like applause that only she could hear. The following months unfolded like pages from a book written in two languages, one of duty and one of rediscovered faith. The scandal that had threatened to collapse the Takahama Foundation faded from the headlines, replaced by stories of reform, humility, and a quiet revival led by its youngest chairman. Yet, for Mary, life did not return to its old rhythm. It deepened. She spent her mornings teaching Japanese children conversational English, her afternoons helping elderly locals practice simple greetings in both tongues, and her evenings writing reflections that blended the lessons of language with the mercy of understanding. Tokyo, once overwhelming in its brilliance, now felt like a vast classroom humming with voices trying, each in their own way, to be heard. One evening, as the sun melted behind the skyline and the first lamps flickered to life along the Sumida River, Mary was invited to a small dinner at Hiro's home. It was the first time she had seen him outside of the foundation's walls, and she noticed that his house, though grand, carried none of the ostentation typical of wealth. The walls were lined with photographs of his parents, old family recipes framed like heirlooms, and a piano tucked beside the window where his mother used to play. His father greeted her warmly, frail but radiant, his gratitude undiminished by time. "We wanted to thank you," he said softly, "for restoring not only our family's reputation but our sense of purpose." Hiro poured tea, the gesture deliberate and precise, as if echoing the bow she had once offered his father months ago. "The board wanted to send you a check," he said, his tone half amused, half apologetic. "But I told them that would insult you." Mary laughed quietly, shaking her head. "You were right. Money can't repay something that wasn't a debt." There was a stillness then, a pause so natural that it felt like a shared breath. After dinner, they moved to the veranda overlooking the river. The night air was cool, carrying the distant scent of jasmine and the faint echo of city life. Hiro leaned on the railing beside her, his sleeves rolled up, his posture uncharacteristically unguarded. "When I was a boy," he said, "I used to believe that success was a fortress. If you built it high enough, no one could hurt you." His eyes glimmered in the lamplight, their sharpness softened by exhaustion and clarity. "But I've learned it's also a cage. The higher you build, the smaller the sky becomes." Mary listened, her gaze drifting toward the slow current below. "Maybe it's not about building walls," she said thoughtfully. "Maybe it's about bridges. They might shake, but at least they let people cross." Hiro smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries both acknowledgement and surrender. "That's why I wanted to show you something," he said. He led her back inside, where a stack of papers waited on the dining table plans for a new cultural center in New York, a partnership between the foundation and an American literacy program. "We'll name it after my mother," he said quietly, "but the first inscription on the entrance will be your words. Respect needs no translation." For a long time, Mary said nothing. The plans before her seemed both unreal and inevitable, as if the moment she had spoken those words months ago had already been traveling toward this future. "It's too much," she whispered, her voice trembling with the humility of disbelief. "It's just enough," Hiro replied gently. "You reminded us that kindness isn't an act of charity, it's a responsibility." When she left that night, the city was washed in rain, its lights rippling across puddled streets like fragments of stained glass. She walked slowly, umbrella tucked under her arm, savoring the quiet rhythm of her steps. At a crosswalk, she paused beside a young couple arguing softly, their frustration thick with misunderstanding. The girl muttered something in English, the boy in Japanese, and neither seemed to grasp the other's meaning. Without thinking, Mary stepped forward, bridging their words with a calm translation that melted their tension into laughter. They thanked her, embarrassed but grateful, and as they walked away hand in hand, she realized she had just lived the smallest echo of her own story, an act so ordinary it was almost divine. Weeks passed, and the new project gained attention from both nations' media. Hiro insisted she remain at the center of it, though Mary preferred to work behind the scenes, teaching, advising, guiding young translators. The more she gave, the lighter her days felt, as though each small act of understanding was lifting the remnants of her past grief one syllable at a time. She began writing letters to her daughter back home, describing Tokyo not as a city of wealth or wonder, but as a place where respect was spoken in gestures rather than titles. One morning she received a letter, in return a photograph of her daughter, now standing in front of a classroom in Queens, teaching children from 5 different countries. On the back, written in her daughter's tidy handwriting, were 4 words: "You taught me this." Mary pressed the photo to her chest, eyes wet with pride that felt larger than the ocean between them. By early spring, the foundation announced the groundbreaking of the new cultural center. Reporters called it a bridge between East and West, a phrase that made Mary smile because she knew the bridge had already been built long before any stone was laid. On the day of the ceremony, Hiro asked her to give a short address. She spoke not of titles or achievements, but of the small, fragile acts that keep humanity intact: the bow of a stranger, the courage to listen, the grace of an apology. "Power fades," she said, her voice echoing through the courtyard, "but respect endures." It's the one language we all begin to understand when the world grows quiet enough. As she stepped down from the podium, Hiro met her with a nod that needed no words. The wind carried the scent of rain again, mingled with cherry blossoms drifting from the nearby park. In that moment, surrounded by people who had once been strangers but now felt like kin, Mary understood the truth her journey had always whispered. Kindness, when spoken fluently, never ends, it only changes its accent. The months drifted into summer, and Tokyo glowed beneath a curtain of humid light that made the streets shimmer like mirrors of memory. The new cultural center neared completion, its glass facade catching the morning sun, reflecting the sky as though it were built from fragments of hope rather than steel and stone. Each day, Mary walked the short distance from her small apartment to the site, greeting the workers in slow, careful Japanese that always made them smile. She had become a kind of quiet legend among them, the foreign woman who spoke like a local and listened like a friend, the one whose kindness had changed the life of a billionaire's family and, in turn, the course of their foundation. But for Mary, it was not legend. It was work, simple and grounding, the daily act of translating care into something the world could touch. One morning, as she arrived at the center, Hiro was waiting near the entrance, his suit jacket off, sleeves rolled up, a streak of dust along his cuff. "I've been helping the crew," he said with a grin that carried a boyish ease rarely seen on his face. "They think I'm terrible with a hammer." Mary laughed softly, adjusting the scarf around her neck. "Maybe you're better with bridges," she said, glancing at the arching walkway that stretched across a shallow koi pond. "Those require patience instead of nails." Hiro smiled at her words, his gaze steady. "You always make things sound simpler than they are," he said. "But that's why people listen to you." They walked through the half-finished hall together, their footsteps echoing against the wide marble floor. In the center of the room stood a tall white column engraved with the phrase they had chosen together: "Respect needs no translation." Workers moved around it with quiet reverence, polishing its base as though preparing it for something sacred. Mary paused beside it, fingertips brushing the cool surface, the words shimmering faintly in the morning light. "I never imagined something I said in a whisper would end up carved in stone," she murmured. Hiro looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Whispers are what start the loudest revolutions," he said. "The world just takes a while to catch up." Later that afternoon, a meeting with journalists was scheduled at the foundation. Mary disliked interviews, the bright lights, the insistent questions, the way people tried to distill her story into a headline that missed its heart. Still, she went, because Hiro asked her to. The reporters wanted to know if her gesture that night in New York had been rehearsed, if she had known who Mr. Takahama was, if she had hoped for reward. She answered each question with the same calm tone, her words deliberate but warm. "I didn't know who he was," she said, "and I didn't need to. Respect shouldn't depend on recognition." The room fell silent for a moment before the clicking of cameras resumed, as though no one knew what to do with a truth so unadorned. That evening, after the press had gone, Mary found herself on the rooftop terrace of the foundation, watching the city dissolve into dusk. Tokyo's skyline looked softer at that hour, its lights emerging like scattered prayers across the horizon. Hiro joined her, carrying 2 cups of green tea, the steam curling upward like fading thoughts. "You handled that beautifully," he said. "The world keeps trying to make you into a symbol, but you just keep being human." She smiled faintly, her eyes following a distant train cutting across the bridge. "Symbols fade," she said quietly. "People remember gestures." The air thickened with the smell of summer rain, and thunder rolled far away, soft and hollow. For a moment neither spoke. Then Hiro said, "My father wants to step down officially next month. He says he's finally ready to rest." Mary nodded, understanding the quiet finality beneath his words. "And you?" she asked. "Are you ready to take his place?" Hiro's answer came slowly. "I think so, but I want to do it differently. Less command, more connection. I've spent years learning how to lead. You taught me how to listen. When the rain came, it arrived gently, almost tender, as though the sky itself feared breaking the fragile stillness between them. They stayed there, the two of them, beneath a shared umbrella, the world below blurred into pools of gold and silver light. "You know," Hiro said, his voice softened by the rain's rhythm, "if that night in New York hadn't happened, my father and I might never have spoken again. He was angry with me for years for becoming the kind of man who mistook pride for strength." Mary glanced at him, her voice low. "Maybe the universe wanted someone to remind both of you that strength and humility can exist in the same sentence." The next morning brought a letter from New York, a handwritten invitation from the restaurant where everything began. Harrison and Elm was celebrating its 50th anniversary and had chosen to honor ordinary acts of extraordinary humanity. The manager, Sophie, had included a note in familiar handwriting. "You once said kindness doesn't offend anyone. You were right. Come home if you can." Mary read the letter twice before folding it neatly into her pocket. When she told Hiro, he smiled. "You should go," he said. "Stories need endings, even if life doesn't." A few weeks later, Mary stood once again beneath the chandeliers of Harrison and Elm, the familiar scent of polished wood and rosemary butter washing over her like déjà vu. The restaurant had changed, new faces, new decor, but the essence remained the same: quiet elegance and the hum of conversations that hid 100 small dramas. Sophie greeted her with a hug that felt more like an apology. "You were right all along," she said. "Sometimes dignity doesn't need defending. It just needs to be witnessed." During the ceremony, as applause filled the room, Mary found herself glancing toward the corner table by the window, the very spot where an old man once sat ignored and unseen. For a moment, she imagined him there again, smiling as he had that night, and felt the strange comfort of knowing that kindness, once released into the world, never truly vanished. It simply changed hands. When she returned to Tokyo, the foundation's grand opening awaited her. The new center gleamed like a mirror of light beside the river, its doors open, its halls echoing with laughter and music. As she stepped inside, Hiro met her with a bow deeper than any she had ever received. "Welcome home," he said simply. And in that instant, surrounded by people speaking 100 languages, yet sharing one emotion, Mary realized that home was not a place, but the quiet space between respect given and respect received the language she had spent her whole life trying to teach, now spoken back to her by the world itself. Autumn crept softly into Tokyo, dyeing the park trees outside Mary's apartment in strokes of gold and rust, the colors shifting like fading chapters in a story she hadn't realized she was still writing. The foundation's new center had been open for nearly 2 months, and each day its glass corridors filled with visitors from around the world, students, executives, and travelers drawn not by prestige, but by the simple curiosity of what it meant to communicate without barriers. Mary often stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a smile and a gentle bow, her name tag small and unassuming. Most didn't realize who she was, the woman whose words had carved the motto above the door, but that anonymity comforted her. She didn't need to be seen anymore. It was enough to know that something she'd started had taken root. Hiro had thrown himself fully into his role as director, balancing business strategy with cultural outreach, spending more time among teachers and students than in boardrooms. He had changed, subtly but entirely. The sharp impatience that once edged his every gesture had softened into presence, a quiet attentiveness that seemed to ripple outward. Sometimes, when he passed Mary in the hallway, their eyes met briefly, and a shared understanding flickered there, something wordless yet complete, born of trust rather than title. She often thought that if his late mother could see him now, she'd smile at the man her son had finally become. Still, success carries its shadows. Rumors began to surface about corporate partners frustrated with Hiro's new priorities, investors uneasy about the foundation's focus on soft values over profit-driven projects. Mary overheard snippets of heated discussions during late-night meetings, the kind where the air grew heavy with unsaid accusations. Hiro tried to protect her from it, but she could see the strain lining his face, the fatigue in his shoulders. One evening, after a particularly tense board session, she found him alone in the main hall, lights dimmed, staring at the engraved column that read, "Respect needs no translation." His reflection in the glass looked older, almost fragile. "They think I've lost perspective," he said quietly without turning. "They don't understand that perspective is exactly what we've gained." Mary stepped closer, her voice steady but tender. "They're afraid," she said. "Afraid of what they can't measure. Respect doesn't fit on a spreadsheet." Hiro exhaled slowly, the sound almost a laugh. "You always make chaos sound poetic," he said. "Maybe I should put you in charge." She smiled. "No, you're doing fine. Just remember, truth needs patience as much as courage." He nodded, eyes bright with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Days later, a letter arrived from New York, this time from Kiki, her daughter, who had read about the Tokyo Center in a magazine. "You look so happy in the photo," the letter began. "I think Dad would have been proud. I'm saving to visit you next summer. Maybe you can show me the bridge you built." Mary read the line again and again, her throat tightening with gratitude. The bridge, her daughter meant, wasn't the physical walkway in front of the center, but the invisible one that spanned continents, hearts, and generations. As winter approached, Tokyo grew colder, the nights long and crystalline. The foundation prepared for its first global conference, a gathering meant to celebrate the year's achievements and outline future goals. Delegates from over 20 countries would attend, including representatives from the United Nations. It was to be Hiro's defining moment, a chance to prove that the Foundation's philosophy could hold weight beyond sentiment, yet the pressure mounted in quiet, corrosive ways. Rival corporations whispered that the project was unsustainable, a vanity built on emotion rather than economics. Some board members began distancing themselves, and Hiro's confidence faltered beneath the polite masks he wore. On the night before the conference, a rare snowfall blanketed the city. Mary, unable to sleep, walked through the silent streets toward the river, her breath visible in the frosty air. The water shimmered like glass under the moon, and she thought of the night she had first bowed to Mr. Takahama, how the world had stopped just long enough for kindness to make itself known. She realized then that the story wasn't about one act or one person, it was about endurance, about the way gentleness persisted even when cynicism tried to bury it. When she returned, a light was still on in the Foundation's conference hall. Through the window, she saw Hiro sitting at a long table, papers spread before him, the fatigue etched into every angle of his face. She knocked lightly on the door, and he looked up, startled but relieved. "You should be asleep," he said. She smiled. "So should you." He rubbed his eyes and gestured toward the empty chair beside him. "I keep rewriting my speech," he admitted. "Every draft sounds like an apology." "Then stop apologizing," she said gently. "You're not asking the world for forgiveness, you're reminding it to remember." She reached for one of the papers, scanning the lines filled with technical terms and policy language. "This isn't your voice," she said softly. "Speak the way you did to your father that night. Speak like someone who knows respect isn't weakness." He looked at her, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in days. "Will you stay for the conference?" he asked. "I'd feel better if you were in the room." The next morning dawned pale and silver, sunlight glinting off the snow-covered rooftops. The conference hall filled quickly, the air alive with murmurs in a dozen languages. Mary sat near the back, her scarf neatly folded in her lap, listening as Hiro stepped to the podium. He began with a story, not statistics or strategy, but the same story that had begun it all. He spoke of a waitress in New York, of a moment when compassion had silenced a room, and of how that silence had become a kind of prayer for understanding. His words carried through the hall like a steady current, dissolving barriers more effectively than any translation ever could. By the time he finished, the applause rose not out of obligation but out of recognition, the kind of applause that comes when truth has finally found its voice. From her seat, Mary felt her eyes sting, not with pride, but with awe at how far kindness had traveled since that single night in Manhattan. When the applause faded, Hiro glanced toward the back of the room and found her there, smiling faintly. Their eyes met for a brief second, and in that silent exchange, both of them understood that they had reached something beyond victory, something closer to peace. The snow outside continued to fall, soft and endless, covering the city in white as though the sky itself had chosen to bow. The applause from the conference seemed to echo long after the crowd had gone, lingering in the polished corridors like a melody too honest to fade. For the next few days, the foundation thrived in the glow of renewed faith. Media outlets praised Hiro's vision, calling his speech a quiet revolution in global leadership. Donations doubled, invitations poured in, and the world seemed, for a fleeting moment, willing to believe that empathy could coexist with ambition. Yet beneath the applause, a faint unease began to ripple whispers that success always draws shadows, that not everyone rejoiced in this newfound harmony. Mary sensed it before anyone said a word. She noticed the way Hiro's assistant avoided her eyes during meetings, how board members began speaking in hushed tones when she entered the room. The shift was subtle, like a breeze turning before the storm, but she had lived long enough to know that calm often precedes the fracture. One afternoon, she found a folder left by mistake on her desk, a financial report marked confidential, showing an anonymous donation that exceeded every other by millions. The donor's name was hidden behind legal language, but the address was unmistakably from a company Hiro's competitors owned. That evening, as twilight stretched over the city, she went to find Hiro in his office. The room smelled faintly of cedar and ink, papers scattered like fallen leaves across the mahogany desk. He looked up from his computer, exhaustion etched deep beneath his eyes. "You shouldn't be here this late," he said gently. "Neither should you," she replied, laying the folder before him. "This doesn't look like philanthropy, it looks like a trap." And Hiro's face darkened as he read, his jaw tightening with quiet fury. "They want leverage," he said finally. "They're buying credibility so they can later claim we're complicit in their schemes." He closed the folder with deliberate calm, as though sealing away his anger. "If this leaks, everything we've built will collapse." Mary watched him, her voice low but firm. "Then tell the truth before someone else does. The moment you hide it, you've already lost." "Oh." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the light from the desk lamp cutting sharp lines across his face. "You make it sound simple," he said, "but truth has a cost." Mary stepped closer, her tone steady as steel. So does silence. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the city outside, a symphony of horns and wind and faraway trains. Then Hiro nodded, the decision forming quietly between them. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll call a press conference." When the news broke the next day, the world reacted with disbelief. Hiro stood before dozens of cameras, admitting that a rival company had offered a donation tied to unethical practices, and that the foundation would reject the funds entirely. His statement was calm, transparent, and resolute. The backlash was immediate. Stocks fell, investors threatened withdrawal, and the media oscillated between calling him brave and foolish. But Mary, watching from the back of the room, felt only pride. She saw in him the reflection of that night in New York when silence had broken for the sake of dignity. Over the next week, the storm intensified. Critics accused Hiro of sabotaging his father's legacy. Allies abandoned him to protect their own reputations. Yet amid the chaos, letters began arriving at the foundation, handwritten notes from teachers, students, and ordinary people, thanking him for proving that morality still had a place in modern business. One note, written in careful penmanship by a 12-year-old boy, read simply, "Thank you for being honest. My father says it's rare." Late one evening, Hiro invited Mary to his home again. The air outside carried the scent of autumn rain, and she could hear the soft chime of wind bells as he opened the door. His father sat near the window, reading quietly, his frail hands steady despite the tremor of age. "You've done well," Mr. Takahama said, his voice gentle but certain. "The truth is heavy, but it's the only thing that doesn't rot." Hiro bowed deeply, and when he straightened, his eyes glistened with restrained emotion. "I learned that from her," he said, glancing toward Mary. They shared dinner in near silence, the kind that feels like conversation without words. Afterward, Hiro walked her to the gate, the night thick with the scent of wet cedar. "They might replace me," he said finally, his tone calm but laced with weariness. "The board wants someone less disruptive." Mary smiled faintly. "Let them. Positions can be taken. Integrity can't." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "You always manage to sound like the ending of a story I haven't finished writing." The following morning, Mary returned to the foundation to find the lobby unusually crowded. Staff members stood clustered near the entrance, their faces pale with confusion. On the screen above the reception desk flashed breaking news. Hiro Takahama resigns as director of the Takahama Cultural Foundation. Her breath caught, though she had expected it. The accompanying footage showed him standing outside the building, bowing deeply to reporters before walking away without a single word. By evening, the city was awash in debate, some calling him a hero, others labeling him reckless. But as the noise grew, something unexpected happened. Visitors began leaving flowers and letters at the foundation's steps. The column bearing the words, "Respect needs no translation," became a quiet shrine, surrounded by folded paper cranes and thank you notes written in dozens of languages. It was as though the very act of stepping down had elevated him beyond the role of leader, transforming him into something purer, a reminder of conscience. When Mary saw the growing sea of tributes, she felt a slow ache of pride mixed with melancholy. She had known from the beginning that Hiro's strength lay not in his position, but in his willingness to risk it. That night, she stood alone before the column, tracing the carved letters with her fingertips, her reflection wavering in the polished marble. The city's neon lights shimmered through the glass like distant constellations, and she whispered a quiet truth that only the walls would hear. "Respect doesn't vanish," she said softly. "It simply changes hands." All D. As the wind moved through the courtyard, scattering the paper cranes into the dark, Mary realized that what they had built no longer belonged to them. It belonged to everyone who believed that dignity was still worth defending. The thought filled her with both sorrow and grace, a strange peace born from knowing that even loss, when chosen with integrity, could become a form of triumph. And somewhere beyond the skyline she imagined Hiro walking through the rain, free from the weight of titles, carrying nothing but the quiet assurance that the story they had written together no longer needed their names to endure. Winter returned quietly, wrapping Tokyo in silver light and soft mist that blurred the skyline into a watercolor of memory and renewal. The Takahama Foundation continued its work under new leadership, though the heart of it, the philosophy Hiro had built, remained intact, echoing through every classroom, gallery, and speech. His resignation, meant to silence the organization, had instead transformed it into something untouchable, a movement of conscience too widespread to contain. Students still recited Mary's words at the entrance each morning, their voices small but sincere. Respect needs no translation. And in those syllables, the spirit of everything she and Hiro had fought for seemed to breathe again. Mary had stayed on quietly, refusing offers to assume any official role. She preferred the simplicity of teaching, guiding interns, and tending to the language garden, a small courtyard where multilingual phrases were engraved on glass panels, glowing at night like lanterns of understanding. It had become her favorite place, a sanctuary within the city's restless rhythm. She often sat there after dusk, watching the reflections of words ripple across the pond, wondering how something as delicate as compassion could survive in a world built on speed and transaction. Yet every evening, when she heard laughter from passing students or saw strangers bow to one another at the gate, she knew it could. Hiro had vanished from public life. The last she heard, he was traveling through small towns in rural Japan, funding schools under an alias and helping rebuild libraries destroyed by storms. His father had passed away peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind a simple will that requested no monument, only a line of text carved on a wooden plaque beside the foundation's garden. He lived with honor, because one woman reminded him how. When Mary saw it for the first time, she stood there for a long while, the winter wind threading through her gray hair, her heart full of quiet ache and gratitude. One evening, she returned to her apartment to find a letter slipped under the door. The handwriting was familiar, deliberate but unsteady, the kind that trembles not from weakness, but from emotion. It was from Hiro. He wrote of the countryside's silence, of children learning English under the shade of persimmon trees, of villagers who taught him humility without words. "You once said bridges shake but still hold," the letter read. "You were right. I'm learning to walk across them without fear." At the bottom, he had added a postscript. "The new school will open next spring. Its name will be the Collins Institute." Mary folded the letter slowly, pressing it to her chest as tears blurred the ink. She had never wanted her name on anything. But this was different. It wasn't recognition. It was continuation. It was proof that the language of kindness had found new speakers. The next day, she stood before her students and told them the story not of fame or sacrifice, but of how one greeting, offered without expectation, could ripple through lifetimes. "Words," she said, "are only as powerful as the heart behind them. When spoken with truth, they don't fade, they multiply." The months that followed moved gently, carrying her through quiet routines and the subtle satisfaction of witnessing seeds take root. The foundation expanded its programs, bridging communities across Asia and America, each partnership carrying echoes of the night that had started it all. Journalists occasionally tried to reach her for interviews, but she always declined. "The story doesn't need me anymore," she would say with a smile. "It's speaking fine on its own." Oh. On the first anniversary of Mr. Takahama's passing, a memorial ceremony was held at the garden. Lanterns floated across the pond, their reflections trembling like living constellations. People from every corner of the world attended, some who had never met him, others who owed him new beginnings. Mary gave a short address, her voice steady despite the cold. "He once told me that respect begins where pride ends," she said, "but I think it continues wherever kindness refuses to die." Her words drifted through the winter air, settling softly over the crowd like snowfall. After the ceremony, she lingered by the garden's edge as the lanterns drifted farther down the waterway. The air smelled faintly of cedar and tea, and somewhere, a child laughed the same pure, unguarded sound she had always believed was the truest translation of hope. She thought of her daughter back in New York, now directing her own cultural program, and felt a deep, steady warmth in her chest. Life, she realized, had a way of returning what it borrowed, just in forms we no longer expected. Later that night, as she walked home beneath a canopy of city lights, snow began to fall again. Slow, deliberate, as if the heavens themselves were keeping pace with her thoughts. Each flake landed softly on her coat, melting instantly into the warmth of her skin. She paused at a crosswalk, watching the flow of headlights blur through the falling white, and for a moment she imagined Hiro somewhere in the countryside, standing beneath the same sky, feeling the same snow. 2 lives, 2 languages, one truth still binding them across distance. When she reached her apartment, she poured herself a cup of tea and opened the balcony door. The night air rushed in, cold and alive, carrying with it the faint chime of bells from the riverfront shrine. She closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her until memory and present blurred into one continuous breath. The past no longer felt like a story behind her. It had become the rhythm beneath everything still unfolding. As she sipped her tea, she whispered a phrase she had once taught to her students, her voice barely louder than the falling snow. "Words build worlds," she said, "but silence keeps them standing." And for the first time in many years, she felt no need to explain, no urge to teach or translate. The world at last seemed to understand. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the city in white. The lights from the foundation shimmered faintly in the distance, their glow bending through the mist like a promise kept. Somewhere beyond that glow, the bridges they had built of language, of compassion, of faith, still held strong, trembling just enough to prove they were alive. And in that trembling, Mary found her peace, knowing that respect, once spoken into the world, never disappears. It simply finds new hearts willing to echo its sound. Spring returned to Tokyo like a long, slow exhale, brushing color back into the trees and light back into the faces of those who had endured the gray. The city felt softer now, tempered by the quiet triumph of its own resilience. Cherry blossoms unfolded above the river, their petals drifting over the garden of the Takahama Foundation, where visitors still came daily to walk the stone path engraved with words from a waitress who had once bowed to a stranger. Mary often arrived early, carrying a small basket of tea leaves for the staff, moving through the corridors with the unhurried grace of someone who no longer mistook movement for progress. Each morning she paused before the memorial plaque dedicated to Hiro's father, resting her fingertips lightly on the carved wood, whispering a few words in Japanese, simple, reverent, and entirely her own. It had been almost a year since Hiro's last letter. She thought of him often, not with longing but with a kind of calm respect, like one thinks of a mountain seen once in clear weather. His silence didn't worry her. It felt deliberate, as though he had finally found peace in places that didn't demand applause. Yet one afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the cherry trees, a courier arrived at the foundation, handing her a package wrapped in coarse brown paper with foreign stamps pressed along the edge. The sender's name, written in neat black ink, made her heart pause. H. Takahama. Inside was a single photograph and a folded sheet of paper. The photo showed a small school nestled in green hills, children laughing as they chased kites through an open courtyard. On the side of the building, hand-painted in both Japanese and English, were the words, "Collins Institute of Cultural Understanding." Beneath the photo, the note read, "They speak your language here, both the one of words and the one of hearts." There was no signature, only a pressed cherry blossom tucked between the folds. Mary sat for a long time without moving, the photo trembling slightly in her hands. She thought of the path that had led her here, the restaurant, the silence, the bow, the long road between humility and healing. Everything she had done, every word she had spoken, had carried her to this single fragile truth, that kindness, once released, becomes its own living thing, moving through people the way wind moves through trees, unseen yet undeniable. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the skyline, she stood on the terrace overlooking the garden. A soft wind carried the scent of rain and magnolia blossoms, stirring the lanterns that lined the path. Students lingered near the koi pond, speaking in a mosaic of languages, their laughter rising like birds startled into flight. For the first time in a long while, Mary felt her own story settling, not ending, but finding its rightful shape. She thought of Hiro's father's words, "Respect begins where pride ends." Now she understood the second half that had never been spoken aloud, and it endures where love begins. In the weeks that followed, her health began to waver. The years of long hours and quiet sacrifices finally caught up with her body, though her mind remained sharp and her heart still beat with the same stubborn rhythm of purpose. The staff insisted she take time to rest, but she refused to retreat entirely. "If I stop moving," she said with a faint smile, "the stories might forget where to find me." So she continued teaching in shorter sessions, sitting beneath the garden canopy while her students gathered around, notebooks open, eyes bright with the hunger of discovery. She taught them not just pronunciation or grammar, but patience, the art of listening before speaking. Language, she would tell them, isn't about being understood. It's about understanding first. Oh. One afternoon, as she ended her final class of the season, the youngest student, a quiet girl with wide brown eyes, approached her with a handmade card. Inside, written in careful hiragana, were the words, "Sensei, you taught me to speak without fear." Mary closed the card slowly, her chest tightening with something tender and eternal. "You taught me too," she whispered. That night, the rain came again, steady and rhythmic, tapping against her window like a memory returning to visit. She sat by her desk, the photo from Hiro resting beside her cup of tea, and wrote him a final letter, not one of farewell, but of gratitude. "I see you in every act of courage here," she wrote. "Every time someone chooses honesty over comfort, or empathy over indifference, I hear your father's laughter and your mother's music. You gave the world a foundation, but you gave me something simpler, the faith that goodness, even quiet goodness, always finds its echo." She sealed the letter and placed it in her drawer, unsure if she would ever send it. Weeks passed, and her body grew frailer, but her presence remained a quiet anchor in the foundation. On the morning of the first full bloom, she rose early and made her way to the garden alone. The cherry trees arched above her, their blossoms falling like snow against her hair. She sat on the bench facing the engraved column, tracing the familiar words with her hand one last time. Around her, the city stirred awake the faint hum of traffic, the rustle of paper, the pulse of life continuing without pause. As the petals fell across her lap, she closed her eyes and whispered a line she had once said to Hiro, the one she hoped he still remembered. "Kindness isn't quiet. It just waits for the world to listen." Her breathing slowed, her thoughts dissolving into the sound of the wind. In that moment, the world seemed to bow not in mourning, but in gratitude. By evening, when the staff found her, she looked peaceful, as if she had merely fallen asleep beneath the blossoms. The letter to Hiro remained in her drawer, the photograph beside it, and on her desk lay a single sheet of paper bearing one final note in her elegant handwriting. "Respect never ends. It simply finds new voices willing to speak it." In the days that followed, Tokyo wept softly with rain, the kind that feels like memory washing over stone. People came from across the city to leave flowers at the garden, their offerings piling beneath the column that bore her words. And when the cherry trees shed their final petals, the courtyard shimmered pink and white, a living translation of everything she had ever believed, that compassion, once spoken, never truly fades. It just changes language. The morning after Mary's passing, the garden was silent except for the steady murmur of the river and the faint rustle of petals drifting across the pond. The news spread gently, almost reverently, carried not by headlines but by whispers that traveled through classrooms, offices, and the narrow streets of Tokyo like a soft wind. No one announced her death. They simply felt it, the way one feels a light dim slightly in a room and knows something precious has gone. At the Takahama Foundation, staff members lit candles along the garden path, their small flames bending in the spring breeze as though bowing. Visitors arrived one by one, not out of obligation, but because something in them remembered her voice, her patience, the way she looked at people as if each one carried an unspoken poem she wanted to translate. By noon, the garden was filled with quiet movement, students laying flowers, children folding paper cranes, elders murmuring prayers in languages that mingled like the chorus of a single hymn. Someone placed her old apron from Harrison and Elm beside the memorial stone, neatly folded, a symbol of the life she had lived before the world noticed her. Above the scene, the engraved words on the column "Respect needs no translation" caught the sunlight, scattering it across the blossoms like tiny fragments of glass. And though no music played, the moment carried its own rhythm, the soft percussion of wind, the bass of distant city noise, the fragile melody of morning turned into gratitude. Across the sea, in the hills of northern Japan, Hiro stood outside the Collins Institute, the photograph of Mary still folded in his coat pocket. The children had gathered that morning to release paper lanterns into the sky, their small hands clutching the strings as teachers helped light the candles within. When the first lantern lifted, its golden glow rose slowly, floating higher until it joined dozens more, turning the sky into a map of trembling stars. Hiro watched in silence, his throat tight, his heart full of everything words could no longer contain. "She taught me how to listen," he said finally, his voice breaking against the wind. "And listening changed everything." Later that week, he flew to Tokyo, arriving quietly at dawn. The city still smelled of rain, the streets glistening with reflected light. At the foundation, he walked through the familiar hallways, pausing beside the bench where Mary had last Saturday. Her teacup still rested on the table, faintly stained but untouched. He placed a single white lily beside it, then turned toward the column and bowed deeply, not as a man honoring the dead, but as a student saluting a teacher who had given him the language of decency. When he straightened, tears blurred the world into a watercolor of color and motion. Yet even through that blur, the blossoms seemed to glow brighter, their gentle fall like applause from the sky. As days turned into weeks, the story of the waitress and the billionaire's family found new life. It was retold in classrooms, in news features, in children's storybooks that spoke of kindness as a quiet revolution. Her face appeared in paintings and short films, but what endured most was not her image. It was her echo, the reminder that humility once spoken becomes immortal. And somewhere, in every bow, every smile, every act of patience shared between strangers, a fragment of her voice lingered. Each year after, on the anniversary of her death, lanterns were released over the river at dusk. They rose into the indigo sky, drifting toward the horizon where city lights met the stars. The foundation called the ceremony the Listening Night, a tribute to the woman who taught the world that silence could speak louder than power. Children recited her final words, the ones found on her desk, etched now into the marble gate. Respect never ends. It simply finds new voices willing to speak it. And as the final lanterns disappeared into the dark, the city below shimmered with the gentle hum of life-continuing waitresses serving late-night meals, strangers offering umbrellas to one another in the rain, fathers teaching their sons to bow, not out of duty but understanding. The world had not become perfect, but it had learned to pause. And in that pause between action and reaction, pride and grace, Mary's story continued to live, not as a memory, but as a quiet, enduring truth, that kindness, once given, never dies. It only travels onward, waiting for the next heart brave enough to listen.